Hi guys, Chris Dorry here. Today I'll be talking about the fundamental mistakes that Collingwood have been making, specifically with relation to the trade and free agency period and their list management decisions over the last few years. So to start us off with, before I go through the key lessons learned, I thought I'd go through some of Collingwood's worst trades. So over the last 6 years, there's been 8 trades that I would identify as frankly poor trades that really need to be assessed. So if we're to look firstly, so I'm starting from, I guess, the worst trades and then working my way down. So the worst one for me has to be the Adam Treloar trade, where not only have you got a contracted player, but one who is desperate to stay at the club. He's someone where he's a star of the competition, led the competition in disposals last year and had the 5th most all-time in AFL, VFL history in 2019. And then again this year, even though he missed some games, well, in terms of the games he played, well, again, highest average in the competition. So when you're looking at that sort of player, someone who, although he didn't have it as much this year, but in years past, he's definitely had a good burst of speed to him and he can create that offense as well. Defensively, of course, that's where he's on the weak side. But in saying that, still, when you've got that caliber of ball winner, accumulator, someone who can generate offense, well, Treloar's definitely someone you want in your team. No doubt about it. And to get this sort of return is just really, really poor. Yes, absolutely he's had hamstring issues, and that should also play a part in any team calculating as to what they should pay for him, but getting only a first round pick, and not a particularly good one at that, and one which will be moved back due to the bidding process with all the next-gen academy players in this year's draft, and to be giving up so much in picks as well, it's incredibly poor. Even if you take out these ones and it's just pick 14 and the Bulldogs' second round pick for next year, well, even next year, well, you're looking at a pick that's probably nearing or around the 40 range in terms of that second round pick, because Treloar, he's going to help the Bulldogs improve, no doubt. So, it's just really a poor return, and if you're going to give that sort of player away and really force them out of the club, well, you better be sure you're getting a good return, and in this case, that was not achieved. So, that's something to definitely look at, even if you need to get creative with trades, whether it's finding players who might be underutilised on another club's list. But in terms of just the sheer valuation, well, it's just a long way off, and that's one of the points I'll be covering later on in the video. So in 2018, really the big one was the trade for Dane Beams, and this is one where it was just giving up far too much in terms of looking into the future. So in terms of Dane Beams, well, he was someone where at the end of the 2018 season, well, you're looking at a 28-year-old, so nearing the end of his career, but the problem there is that he's someone where he lacks durability. So over his career, he might average something like 15, 16 games a year, and he has those years where it could be sub 10 games, and you had all those issues, and then you also had, I guess, the mental health side as well, where he was and really still is battling his demons. So really spending 2 first-round picks, one of which became Georgiades, the other Eli Smith, well, that's just too much to spend on a player like that, where I was quoted at the time as saying I wouldn't spend a first-round pick on Dane Beams, mostly because of the lack of durability factor at that age. So that's something to definitely be aware of, and something that, again, as with all these trades, Collingwood really need to learn from. It's a nice story having him back at Collingwood, in theory, or such as it felt at the time, but I was of the opinion that someone, the likes of a Jared Lyons, who I was very vocal in talking about at the time, well, he got delisted by Gold Coast as, frankly, their best player, and I was saying he's every bit as good of a midfielder as Dane Beams at that time, and he was someone I would have coughed up even possibly up to a second round pick for. And he's gone on, had great success at Brisbane, but then you look at a Beams and it's a bit of a concerning trade where you've really mortgaged your future for someone who is at the end of his career, and it's just a bit of a questionable trade, and one you just hope will be learnt from in the future. And then the third trade, so we're looking at Jaden Stevenson. He won the Rising Star Award in 2018, and to be let go this quickly for such a little return is very poor. And of course with the Stevenson, well, there are obviously deficiencies in his game, and he was dropped a few times this year, But in saying that, he's someone where I would have fully expected him to have rebounded had he been given another year. And it's another case a bit like with a Trelaw, where you're selling at the very low point in his value. If ever you're giving up a player of this ilk, well, you want to give him up while you can get a good return. So yeah, Stevenson's definitely one I would have kept, and is someone where, although he's a great leading forward, he's also got the scope to play as a tall wing, where his endurance testing really excellent. He's shown in the junior ranks from time to time that he can actually push up the field, create a lot of run and carry on a wing. So that's something I'd be looking for at North Melbourne in the future to look towards with Stevenson as a potential path for development beyond just being a, I guess, quick lead out of the goal square forward who can create that separation. So I think there's a few more tools in Stevenson's toolkit, and is someone where I would still think he'd be worth a first round pick for mine. So just not getting that sort of currency is a really disappointing outcome, given, again, a bit like with Trelaw, well, contracted player, you've just extended him, so you don't want to be giving him away for really nothing of significance. So something Collingwood will need to learn from, and a practice that they should really be reconsidering, because when you're forcing out players the likes of Trelaw, Stevenson, when they really want to be staying, well, as a free agent or someone you could potentially trade for in the future, well, who's going to want to join Collingwood if you're going to be really forcing out players who are contracted and really want to stay? It's a step back in terms of competitiveness, and it's not a practice I would be practicing personally in the same position. So the fourth one, so Jared Witts, and in his case it was, well, you had Brodie Grundy, who clear number one ruck, Jared Witts not getting opportunities, but of clear AFL standard. And they couldn't really get any more than this, but in this sort of situation where you've got someone like a ruckman such as a Witts who was of clear AFL quality, well, you do want either a better return for him if you're going to move him on and look for someone maybe of a different position. So what I'd be doing with someone like a Witts, I'd be looking in the trade market and really determining, well, who's out there, who can add to my list? If this is all I can get in terms of picks, well, I'd be wanting a player to even really consider moving someone like Witts on. So next up, so James Aish. So again, a bit like the Beams trade, I really consider this mortgaging the future for someone who, in my opinion, at the time of making the trade, and still now, I don't really consider that AFL standard best 22 player, where, yeah, sure, he's fine as depth, that's fine, but just giving up as much as they did in picks, even one second round pick, I would have been a bit anxious to trade, because that's even still probably a bit much. I thought he was worth probably a third round pick at that time, and I still believe the same. So number 6, so Travis Cloke. So at this stage of his career, so he would have been a 29-year-old at that time. And looking at his career, well, obviously fantastic career. There was even a time where there was some debate as to, well, is Franklin or is it Cloke who is that number one key forward in the game? And absolutely he deteriorated by 2016, even 2015 a bit as well, where Collingwood were playing him out of the goal square. He was relying too much on just winning by strength. People make fun of his kicking, and particularly his field kicking was something that I had trouble with, and absolutely no ground level craft at all. But what was, I guess, getting lost in his game and what he was losing was, I guess, the strong hands overhead, where he used to be someone where it was just vice grip marks where he'd squeeze the air out of the ball. And I'm sure he had some hand or finger injuries that would have really taken away that ability. But in saying that, you're still looking at a really strong mark nonetheless, and someone really strong one-on-one. But what a lot of people aren't aware of with a Cloke is that he had an elite endurance base. So here's someone where you could have absolutely had him at centre-half forward, and that's, in my opinion, what Collingwood should have done over those latter years of his career. And look, if it wasn't going to work as a forward, well, shift him back. He's absolutely someone where one-on-one, he's just got that absolute strength, and in terms of with his marking, with the way he reads it, well, he could have been an intercept marking threat. So in my opinion, if you're only going to get a return of a pick 76, well, you really need to get creative with someone of the game of a Cloke and really try new things, because he's better than that. And although he only had the 1 year with the Bulldogs and that wasn't a good year at all, his numbers in his final year with Collingwood were still good and indicated to me that perhaps there was opportunity to do other things with him, whether it's playing him more as a centre-half forward, maybe shifting him to centre-half back or full-back. So I do believe there was a bit more potential to get a little bit more out of Cloke. And look, if you're dead set on trading him and you're just not happy with keeping him, well then fine, move him for a player that is underutilised or someone who might be able to fill a need from another club's list, because there's always opportunities out there to add rival talent. So number 7, Marley Williams. He's someone that, although he's now just been delisted recently by North Melbourne, well, he was a best 22 player for them, and I believe at the time he was actually, to me anyway, a best 22 player for Collingwood with that really strong one-on-one strength, has that burst of speed. Just trading him for a pick that wasn't going to be used, well, I absolutely would have kept him. And he's someone that I would have had kept around to compete for a spot. Because he's not a dud, he's got some game. So I thought better could have been done. Even if you're committed to moving Williams on, again, I'd be thinking along the lines of, well, maybe you can get a better return or something different at least. So 2016, so the last of the trades that I'll cover today. So moving out Jack Frost I thought was a questionable one, and particularly for the lack of return received. So he was someone where he was very much a capable key back. He was really contending with the likes of a Nathan Brown at the time, and he did have a few seasons where 22 games, 20 games, thereabouts, and he was playing a role. He lacked that, I guess, intercepting and rebounding side, which I do consider really valuable, but nonetheless he was someone where I thought, at least as depth, look, he did have some value, and really I thought he was able to really still at that time contend for a best 22 spot. So just not really getting that sort of return for someone who on another team could have reasonably been seen as a best 22 sort of, at least certainly contender, if not a player for a team. Well, I would have hoped for a little bit better than that. So they're the trades that I feel like Collingwood really should have done better, gotten a bit more creative with, and in a lot of cases really tried new things and even not necessarily moved them on. So now we're on to the most important part of the video. So the fundamental mistakes Collingwood have made and what they need to learn from, and what every other club should also be learning from. So you don't want to be making poor trade valuations, and you don't want to be on the losing side of the deal, as was happening unfortunately in recent years with Collingwood. So you don't want to trade unless it's a win-win and fair value in some way, shape or form, and you need to find a way within any trade to improve your list in some capacity. So maybe that's a trade where you think, yeah, the valuation's about even, and maybe you're bringing in a player that fills a pressing need. Or maybe it's a player for pick where the pick is actually worth what the player is, or vice versa. You're giving up a pick for a player that is legitimately worth that pick. You don't want to be on a trade where really the average footy fan could look at it and say, look, you've lost that one. You don't want to be in that sort of position, because it's not a good look. And ultimately you want to be maximising the value of every player and every pick that you get access to. So number 2, so you want to be targeting players who fill list needs during the trade period to a clear, decisive best 22 standard. So this is a mistake I see often being made. So clubs will bring in these speculative depth players, these players who really haven't played up to a standard where they look like they could play a clear role. And what you want is guys who ideally have the performances behind them, but players you can really distinctively identify that you can say, yep, they're without question going to be a best 22 player, whether it's round 1 next year, whether it's with development, but they're going to definitely get to that standard. That's what you're looking for every time. Otherwise you shouldn't be pulling the trigger on such a trade during the trade period. So number 3, you don't want to be overpaying players, and it's not a sustainable practice that allows for long-term success. So it's a bit like a Trelaw signing him for too many years, or maybe it's signing a Brodie Grundy where maybe it's too many years to give him or too much money. So you really want to be able to identify, well, what are the salaries, who's on the most in the competition, who's on the next most, where is this particular player in relation to those best players in the competition. And you don't want to be paying someone who isn't a top 30 player a top 30 level salary. That's really, for me, a critical thing. And if you have players that are really demanding to be paid that extra money that frankly they're not worth, well, you need to be moving them on. You need to be looking at trades for opposition players or picks that are of equivalent value, and keep bringing players who are either under what you consider to be their real true value, or it's just that's how you really need to look at it. So next up, so you've got clubs should hold off on all contract negotiations until the end of the season. So this is something no one does, but in my opinion everyone should be doing. So whether it's a coach, whether it's a player, you want to wait till the end of the season, because you don't know what's going to happen during a season. Maybe someone does their ACL, tears a hamstring, does a shoulder. You just don't know. Or maybe their performance just falls off a cliff. So you can look at a Collingwood with a Brody Grundy, where going into the season, his last 2 years absolutely sensational. Round 1, top notch, full marks. But then he comes back from the COVID shutdown and starts playing, and really over the course of the season, and particularly the second half, well, his play just wasn't there, and he just really struggled for form in terms of compared to, well, what is his real capabilities. So if you're in a position like a Collingwood and you can just wait till the end of the season to really analyse, well, what's he done? And then you can really determine, well, okay, he's actually worth this. So you really want to be waiting. And what I find as well is that a club might sign a player, sign a coach, and they'll either sign him for too long or sign him prematurely, and then they'll want to delist him and they end up on the rookie list, and then you're just wasting a list position. So that's really the value in waiting. You really don't want to waste any money. You don't want to waste any list positions, because the more money you have available, well, the more guys you can trade for and the more guys you can take as free agents. So rule number 5, instead of offering everyone multi-year deals, offer 1-year contracts and no more for speculative players. So if you're looking at someone and thinking they're not a clear best 22 player, well, don't sign them for multiple years. You don't want to be in that position, as I was just describing, where you've got a contracted player and you're thinking, oh, they're probably not going to be his best 22, so I'll delist him and re-rookie him. You want to have a lot more flexibility than that. And that's the value with shorter contracts, where you can really have a lot more flexibility. And yeah, with 1-year contracts, if players would be asking for more, maybe you do have to sign them for more. But I feel like having that flexibility is really, really valuable, because it just gives you options ultimately. And I think when it comes to the trade period, free agency, it's really, options is really that key thing that you really want to have at your disposal. So point number 6, so you want to avoid backloaded contracts. So this is where Collingwood really got unstuck. So you have all these players that signed long deals, but they're getting a bit too much money out the back end. So what's happened? Well, it's causing a squeeze out of players, and it's forcing the likes of Treloar, Phillips, Stevenson, it's forcing them out. So you don't want to be in that position. So if you're in a position where you've got any salary cap space left, if you can, almost have a slight leaning towards having front-loaded contracts. So again, as the years go by, you've got that little bit of extra wiggle room to add additional players in the future, because ultimately, again, I'll come back to this point, what you want is flexibility. You don't want to be limited in who you can, I guess, acquire. So that's something I'm sure Collingwood is starting to look at, and was probably quite a motivator towards their recent trades. So point number 7, you don't want to be trading players and pay their contracts for other teams. So it's, again, this is the Adam Treloar example, where he goes to Bulldogs, but guess what? Collingwood are paying a good portion of his salaries. So you don't want to be doing that. You want to be doing the opposite. You don't want to overpay players. You instead want to be, I guess, adding players who other teams don't want. So there's those sorts of opportunities, and well done to the Bulldogs for making the most of that opportunity. So the next point, and this is a point that I don't find anyone in the media talks about, I haven't found anyone anywhere talk about, but to me this is the most valuable thing out there. And this is really something that needs to be considered in every trade, as I brought up in the Dane Beams example. So availability is the best ability. So if you're a Joe Danaher, where you're only playing 15 games in 3 years, well, you're not worth too much to me. Or a Nakaya Cockatoo, again, 2 games in the last 15 years, both of which in 2018, well, that's not enough. I want someone who is backing up week after week, playing 20 plus games a year, such as a Ben Brown, where although this year he was hurt, well, if you're giving me 22 every year before that, well, that's a player I'd be more inclined both to invest in if I'm trading for, but it's also something I'd be willing to pay more for. And I think that's a point that's often missed, where if you've got players who get hurt often and miss lots of games, well, they might not be there for you when you really need them during the finals. So that's something that, in my opinion, is incredibly important, and that's something, if I was to be signing guys to contracts, I would be considering strongly. And Brad Crouch is another of those examples where 8 years, 95 games, not enough for me. I wouldn't be paying a big contract for him. So it's those things you really want to be aware of. So, and if there's players who they don't play enough games, they're asking too much money, well, they're the guys I would be putting on the trade market and looking either for players from rival lists or or otherwise opportunities through the draft to get better. So that's probably one of the most important things to be cognizant of, and how much weight clubs put into that, well, I'm not sure, but it's something that I would certainly be advocating put a lot of, I guess, thought into this, because it's really important. So number 9, so you don't want to trade contracted players even if they want out unless you can get a return their worth to you. So again, it's sort of that Trelaw sort of situation where you don't trade a player who's contracted like that, and same with Stevenson, unless you can get a fair return. So if a club's offering you picks and the picks aren't worth it, well, let's look at players. If they're not willing to put up the players who are worth it to you, well, let's explore a third team, and maybe you can get some of their pieces in who might be worth a bit more to you. Or if that's not going to work, well, then you just need to explore another club. So if you're contracted, you just have to hold firm on that, and you can't deviate. But absolutely get creative, try and find ways to make a trade work if someone legitimately has good reasons to go, absolutely. But in saying that, they're a contracted player, so there are times you do need to hold them to that contract. And that's, for me, where I would be drawing the line personally. So get creative, look at every opportunity, but if the valuation isn't right, you can't do it. So point number 10, you don't want to trade contracted players who want to stay unless fair value can be had in return. So again, same concept I've been going through. You really want to be getting a good value in return. So if you can't get a suitable return, even if they want out and they've got good reasons, maybe it's family reasons, what have you, well, again, you really need to hold clubs accountable and make sure they're giving up a suitable return. Because if your valuation is wildly higher than theirs, well, there's something wrong in the process, and the other club need to either lift their offer, or you either deal with a different party, or you just have to hold firm and keep the player. So, and again, absolutely, you get creative, you try and find different players, whether it's their list, another list, but yeah, if the valuation isn't right, you can't do it. So number 11, so you want to add someone to your list management team who specializes in AFL opposition talent identification. So I'm not aware of any club that necessarily does this in terms of recruiting players from opposition lists. If any clubs do, well, congratulations, great move. But to me, when I assess the value of the trade period and free agency period, well, my personal opinion is that it's every bit as valuable as the draft. So you can absolutely build a list through the trade period. St Kilda is doing so. You've had Hawthorn, who had all those years of success, and a lot of that came through the trade period. And then you've had those successful Sydney teams, so bringing in the likes of Mumford, Josh Kennedy in the one-off season for not a lot spent to get them. Well, they're the sort of moves that can really change your team and really make you better in a hurry. So, let's say you've got 4 full-timers, I would want 1 full-timer on opposition talent identification, because it's at least worth a quarter of the value to your list in terms of, I guess, what you can get from opposition teams. Thanks everyone for staying on till the end, and in the description below I'll include links to my trade period review on ESPN, and I'll also include my 2-round Phantom Draft, a link there. Thanks guys, see you in the next video, and make sure you like, comment, subscribe and hit the notification bell for future updates. Bye.